Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am the Editorial Director of Responsible Statecraft at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I am very proud to be moderating today's panel, Is Congress Captured by the Arms Industry? Just last week, the Biden administration issued a proposal for an $842 billion DoD budget for 2024. When adding in other defense-related items outside the Pentagon, it brings the proposal up to a whopping $886 billion. As our expert and friend Bill Hartung, who will be joining us today, said, it is likely that Congress will increase that top line before final passage. And with new military-related money for Ukraine added in, it could reach $1 trillion. This is spending not seen since the peak of World War II. But how is the American government spending this money? Is it even effective? Does it pair with any real strategy for U.S. national security? Or are these top-line figures, which go up and up every year without fail, being driven by industry lobbying and desires? We have plenty of evidence that it is the latter, and the situation is literally leading to dysfunction and waste. For example, the New York Times recently published an extensive report on the successful effort by key members of Congress to prevent the Navy from retiring a number of littoral combat ships, a vessel that was so flawed that it couldn't carry out its basic missions. And it's not the only flawed program. The military-industrial complex is a vast and complicated landscape, and it's difficult often for Americans to wrap their heads around what it is and how it works. We're going to talk today about one significant aspect, how Congress and industry work together to promote weapons and programs that are not in the best interest of national security or even the military forces themselves, but they get pushed along for all the wrong reasons. So I'm going to introduce our expert panel now and launch right into what I expect will be an illuminating and lively discussion. So first, I have the aforementioned Bill Hartung. Bill is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. His work focuses on the arms industry and the U.S. military budget. He was previously the director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy and co-director of the Center's Sustainable Defense Task Force. He's the author of Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, and co-editor with Miriam Pemberton of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War. Next, we have Representative Jackie Speier. Congresswoman Speier represented California's 14th Congressional District, stretching from the southern part of San Francisco through San Mateo County to East Palo Alto from 2008 into just recently, 2002. While in Congress, she served on the House Armed Services Committee, where she was chair of the Military Personnel Subcommittee, and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, where she served as chair of the Subcommittee on Strategic Technologies and Advanced Research, and as a member of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Counterintelligence, and Counterproliferation. And last but not least, Dan Grazier. Dan is a former Marine Corps captain. He served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and his assignments including tours with the 2nd Tank Battalion in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and the 1st Tank Battalion in 29 Palms, California. He has written extensively and lectured on matters of military reform and maneuver warfare. He is a 2000 graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University and a 2012 graduate of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Warfare School and a 2019 graduate of Norwich University with a Master of Arts in Military History. So we got quite a panel today, lots of expertise cumulatively, and I'm going to start off with Bill. Bill, in your recent piece for Responsible Statecraft, when the Biden budget was released, you wrote, this was last week, we can make America and its allies safer for far less money if we adopt a more realistic, restrained strategy and drive a harder bargain with weapons contractors that too often engage in price gouging and cost overruns while delivering dysfunctional systems that aren't appropriate for addressing the biggest threats to our security. You also wrote about the National Defense Authorization Act, otherwise known as NDAA, in December, saying that, quote, the bill calls for near record levels of Pentagon spending, but it chooses to devote much of the funding to costly, dysfunctional weapon systems that are ill-suited to addressing current challenges. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by this and why we really need to be wary of this most recent budget request by the Biden administration?
Yeah, well, first let me say I'm honored to be on this panel with former Representative Speer and Dan Grazier, and of course, Kelly's always a dream to work with. What I've learned from those quotes is I have to stop using the word dysfunctional so often, whether or not it's appropriate to do so. Yeah, well, I think last year's story is kind of a cautionary tale for what might happen this year. As you said, Congress added $45 billion to what the Pentagon asked for. And that 45 has now been folded in essentially as the new floor for the new proposal. And among the things added were more F-35s, which, as Dan Grazier can tell you, is not ready for prime time for various reasons. A $2 billion frigate built in Maine and inserted by a representative from that state. C-130 transport planes, which have been added year after year after year to go to local National Guard units, in this case, at a $1.7 billion price tag for 16 aircraft. And then there was the other aspect, which is very relevant to today's conversation, which was preventing the military from getting rid of systems it didn't want. And so that happened with the Littoral Combat Ship. Representative Speer fought doggedly to stop them, allow that retirement to happen, and she can talk about how that played out. B-1 bombers, F-22 fighter aircraft. And one of the few cases where the Pentagon was trying to actually get rid of some dead wood and open up for new kinds of systems, Congress stood in the way, primarily because systems were at bases in their states or districts, or were being maintained there, or they just wanted to keep production lines alive. So it would be very hard for that kind of parochial interest to magically align with any kind of strategic planning. And of course it doesn't. So I'll leave it there for the moment because I really want to hear from the other panelists. But I think that's what we face this year. There's a plan to try to get rid of a couple more littoral combat ships. That'll undoubtedly be a battle. And there'll be, a push to add any number of things that don't really fit with a logical kind of responsible defense strategy.
Thanks, Bill, for setting the table for us. And I'm all for you using the word dysfunctional as much as possible because I think it actually gets people's attention. And not only is it an apt way to describe a lot of these programs that you're talking about and the way our money is used, but I think it packs a little bit of a punch. Congresswoman, before I go forward, I just want to tell we have a lot of people on this call, which is very exciting. I just want to let folks know if you do have a question, we'll be taking Q&A later on in the program. So just put it in the Q&A chat at the bottom of the screen. Congresswoman, you spoke pretty passionately about the aforementioned Littoral Combat Ship program on the House floor in June 2022 and tweeted, quote, "You wouldn't keep buying one lemon car after another, but that's what Congress is prepared to do. Lemon ships that cost $500 million to build and $59 million per year to maintain. Plus undermanning and fatigue are killing sailors. It's time to decommission all 9 useless LCSs." Can you talk a little bit about how fellow members of Congress reacted to the points that you were making and how industry interests lobby members to keep alive programs that the Pentagon doesn't want anymore? American people are looking at cases like this and wondering, why wouldn't our lawmakers listen to the force commanders about what is right for their readiness? Why do they succumb to the interests that only stand to make money from keeping shoddy programs going?
Thank you, Kelly. And what an honor it is for me to be with Bill and Dan on this panel. It wasn't just in 2022 that I made that kind of plea. I have been on the hunt to rid us of the littoral combat ships for close to a decade. And when I look back at my service in the Armed Services Committee, it's one of the most disappointing efforts because it was so apparent that we were dealing with something that was a fraud. It is the biggest scandal within the military acquisition system, with the exception maybe of the F-35s and the Defense Logistic Agency's activities. But let me just put it in context. So it was first conceived of because we wanted to increase the number of Navy ships, because no matter what they did, we just wanted the numbers to be up. We wanted them to be cheaper and more agile and smaller. The columnist David Axe once called it a Frankenstein warship. Was it a combat vessel, a submarine hunter, a low-cost patroller, or a small, fast amphibious ship? Well, it was actually supposed to be all of those, but the truth is it can't do any of them. So we didn't do testing before we started building. That is a huge, huge mistake. And we had no strategic plan. So the acquisition plan changed 4 times since 2005. We actually changed the name of the Littoral Combat Ship. We took combat out of it after the GAO said that it was not survivable in any kind of war effort. So I was trying to think of how do I make it so that my colleagues will recognize this is just horrible. So that's when I named them lemon ships. And I don't know if you can put up a poster, but I had it on the House floor, and it became so popular that colleagues wanted to have copies of it for their records. But you can see that the USS Freedom, for instance, was commissioned in 2008, and in 2011 it had a 6-inch crack. The U.S. Independence, commissioned in 2010, I mean, literally not even a year later, it had severe corrosion. And you can see through all of those lemons the fact that this was scandalous. That's all you could say about it, that we would continue to manufacture these ships when they were not survivable, in many respects, couldn't even stay on the water. They were typically hauled into to docks because they would lose their engines. So they had cracked hulls, engine failures, unexpected corrosion, software glitches, and weapon malfunctions. So you think, this is no Cylindro. Cylindro was a $500 million problem. This is $500 million per ship. And we continued to build them, even when the department said, finally, no, let's not build them anymore. When I spoke to one of the secretaries of the Navy, he said to me, well, I mean, we can't take them out of commission. We can't decommission them. That would be wasting taxpayer funds. Well, what's wasting taxpayer funds is the fact that it's $50 million a year for each of those ships just to maintain them. So the New York Times just very recently did a story about why these keep being built. And it's all about, the small, and I'm sure they're pretty small contributions made to members on the committee or made to members who have those manufacturing systems in their districts or in their states. I appreciate that you want to make sure that your constituents stay employed. But the GAO even said that, this was back in 2017, if we stop manufacturing the Littoral Combat Ship, that they would still be employed through 2021 with the amount of work that they had to do. And I think there would have been lots of other work that would have been conceived of for them to keep their jobs doing maintenance on ships or building new ships. But this was an idea back in the 90s that we just can't let go of. So it's deeply troubling because all of the reports by the GAO and the Defense Department of Operational Testing and Evaluation have been damning. They've been absolutely damning, and yet we continue to fund them.
Thank you for that breakdown. And it's a pretty depressing prospect. Dan, just to follow up on that a little bit, given everything that we know about the LCS program and the fact that the Navy wants to retire these ships, can you give us a sense, and whether in detail or just more broadly, how is this preventing the Navy from building the ships that it really needs? Does it get in the way of innovation when you're bogged down with trying to keep what is ultimately a flawed program afloat?
Well, one, first off, thank you very much, Kelly, and for having me. And it is an honor to be here with Congresswoman Spear and Bill as well. Having a program that has outlived its usefulness does absorb resources that could be put to better use elsewhere on programs that are far more effective. It's not just the financial aspect, but the services have they have personnel caps. And so to maintain a ship program, you need to have crews for it. You need to have the people on shore maintaining the ships and paying contractors, which is an increasing problem. So yeah, keeping some of these programs around does impact other programs and in particular future programs. And so the services do need to carefully evaluate their needs, based on what the combatant commanders are asking for and based on the resources they have at hand.
And just a two-finger on that, do we frequently see members of Congress actually butting heads with the officers in any of the forces over programs that the Pentagon doesn't want? This seems to me like, as a layperson, you're like, what's going on here? The forces say they don't want this, they want to retire these ships, but these members of Congress are funding them, pushing them anyway. How do you explain that to our viewers here who may not know the machinations of the Pentagon?
Sure, it kind of varies by case because there are certainly sometimes where parochial political interests will trump good decision making, where the services say that they want to do something, but because a ship is stationed in someone's district, the representative there is going to try to keep that because they want to maintain the jobs and they don't want to face questions during the next election cycle about why they allowed all this money to leave their district. But occasionally it is actually useful for Congress to push back when the services want to cut something that is still of value, but the services want to cut it because they'd rather have the budget space to buy something new that might not necessarily be the right thing. So there's a careful balance that needs to be maintained between the civilian leaders and between the military leaders to make sure that the service members who are on the front lines have the right mix of equipment. But finding that balance takes it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to make sure that everybody understands all the issues at play. And it definitely requires people to suspend their own, personal, financial, political interests to make sure that the right decisions are being made.
Great points. Bill, now we're in a situation where the U.S. has earmarked some $60 billion in military-related funding for the war in Ukraine. The 5 defense contractors, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Boeing, they're all reaping the benefits as the military-industrial complex has had to ramp up production for weapons and artillery. Are you concerned that the industry has benefited a little too much? Have you seen a ramping up of the behavior, this dysfunctional behavior that you've been recording throughout your career, ramping up now, that this money is now slooshing through the system? Can you give us some insight on what we can be seeing here today?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to provide Ukraine with what it needs to defend itself. But the contractors, I think, are trying to exploit that need to press for things that they've always wanted, multi-year contracts, less vetting of systems, pushing sales out the door more quickly. Under the guise of cutting red tape, there's a danger that there's going to be open the door to more price gouging, cost overruns, flawed systems coming out the other end. And the money's going to flow over time because a lot of it in the first year was out of stocks, government stocks. So as they pay the contractors to replenish those stocks, that's one of the places we have to keep an eye on what terms are they replenishing, what are they replacing them with, what are the profit margins going to be, are they sole source contracts? And then this whole initiative to expand and supersize the entire military industrial complex based on the purported lessons of Ukraine would mean that we've got a larger machinery to feed going forward. And it's very hard once these systems are established and these financial flows are happening to scale back again. So I would want to keep a close eye on what's being done in the name of Ukraine that may be more in the name of lining the pockets of the contractors who are still paying their CEOs $20 million or more a year, spending billions of dollars buying back their own stock to boost the price, huge dividends. So, none of that's is going to aid anybody's defense. So they're clearly seizing the moment. And of course, they're also wrapping themselves in the notion that they're now the arsenal of democracy. Tell the people of Yemen that after all the arms to Saudi Arabia or to Egypt or to the Philippines. So, if that's their new mantra, then let's challenge them to, live up to it.
Thanks, Bill. Jackie, let's go back to Congress for a second. Are you concerned that members of Congress are bamboozled and thinking that they have to support every shiny new thing because A, it will create jobs, and B, that they are necessary for competing with the latest pacing threat? In today's case, that would be China, or as Bill was pointing out, we have a fight for democracy in Eastern Europe. As a former member of Congress, how do you see some of these arguments capturing Congress and allowing for the floodgates to open wide each budget season?
I would say that there are a lot of competing issues that are on the agendas of most members, and they oftentimes look for the route of least resistance. The Armed Services Committee is populated by members who either have defense contractors in their district or bases in their district, or are themselves in the reserves. So they're very vested in making sure that the military gets everything they want, which really, violates our oversight function, because we're supposed to be looking at a massive budget of discretionary funds that frankly is still not auditable, I should say. And I think there's just an inbred conflict of interest that exists, and it's very hard to break through it. Now, all the work I did on military sexual assault, and it took me 10 years to get that reform in place. I had Democrats who didn't support it early on, and no Republicans. And in part, it was because they saw it as unpatriotic not to be supporting the Department of Defense. Now, where this somehow kind of falls off is here you have a more recent Department of Defense, which surprised me, frankly, when they came forward and said, yes, we want to decommission some of these ships, some of which are fairly new, have only been operational for 6 to 8 years. They were recognizing the mistakes of the past and didn't want to continue them. And yet we couldn't even get a couple of them decommissioned. I think there was a request in the last budget for 9 of them, and in the end, we only got 4 decommissioned. And it's really shameful. So the public is not going to know about something like the LCS. It's just it's too minutia unless you have the media really taking it on. Now, seeing the New York Times take it on as it did was really quite refreshing. If Senator McCain was still alive, may he rest in peace, he was really dogged on the Senate side about the LCS. This is, it's sinful that we continue to fund these particular ships. I mean, they're laughing stock and should be decommissioned, and we should stop bleeding the red ink associated with them.
I'm going to go quickly to one of the Q&A questions because specifically addresses you, Congresswoman, and it's by Miriam Pemberton, who is Bill's co-author. And she asks, Congresswoman, how did you go after dysfunctional weapons in their systems without getting voted out of office? Like, how can you do both in this environment?
So, I have a very good district, had a very good district, and I won those elections by 78% of the vote. So there was a real trust that had been developed over decades, because I had represented that area either in the state legislature or in Congress for almost 40 years. The reason I came onto the Armed Services Committee was not because I had a base in my district. There was one slightly outside, and not because I had a lot of defense contractors. I had just a couple. What brought me to the committee was the issue of sexual assault in the military, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to fix it unless I was on the committee. So I didn't get any blowback from my constituents, and I would think most members would not. Let's be quite clear about this. It's about campaign contributions. And I regret to have to say it, but for a few $1,000s, any one of these defense contractors can be fairly persuasive to members of Congress. I'll give you one kind of interesting example. Back in 2017, I wanted to get an amendment into the defense appropriations bill to reduce the number of LCSs by, I think, 2. Even though the GAO that year said we shouldn't fund any of them. And the Rules Committee made it not germane to a defense appropriation bill. I mean, how can you say it wasn't germane? And Lockheed Martin presumed it was going to become germane, so it put out a letter asking members to vote against it, even before the Rules Committee had met and made it ungermane.
Unbelievable. Dan, let's shift over to the F-35 because I know you've done a ton of work on that particular boondoggle program. It's expected to cost American taxpayers upwards of $1 trillion over the course of the lifetime when all said and done, yet the program is alive and kicking. Can you tell us a bit about the attempts to cut the program? I believe the Biden administration asked for fewer last year, and the ability of Lockheed and its supporters in Congress to thwart those attempts. How is supporting this very expensive program preventing our military forces from seeking out better, more efficient aircraft to achieve our defense goals?
Well, unfortunately, there have been precious few attempts to actually cut the F-35 program in any meaningful way. The Biden administration did request fewer new F-35s in the most recent budget than was expected, which was refreshing. But it wasn't really an attempt to cut the program. But the F-35 program, it's a zombie program. It's a perfect case study in pretty much everything that's wrong with the military industrial congressional complex, because it was a program that was begun as a poor concept. we've known for years that if you try building one aircraft to perform multiple missions, that it ends up not doing any of them very well, and it's also hugely expensive, and which is also going to delay the program by years in most cases. But these programs are started so quickly, and the money starts flowing immediately upon upon approval. And when that happens, the trains essentially left the station, because subcontracts start getting spread all over the country, which builds up the organic political support for these programs. And again, the F-35 is the apotheosis of that phenomena, because components of it are built in 44 or 45, 46 states, upwards of 350 different congressional districts. So nearly everybody on Capitol Hill has their finger in this program at some level, and so it's really difficult to get any member of Congress to to vote against it in any way. You hear a lot of tough talk, and I agree with Congressman Speer. It was great having John McCain on the Senate Armed Services Committee, because he would thunder away at these programs, but at the end of the day, he didn't vote. His votes didn't match his speech a lot of times, and so that's a big problem. So we do need a little more courage and initiative, I would say, from Capitol Hill, that when these when these problems really start manifesting themselves, which they will inevitably do if the program is poorly conceived from the beginning, that it's okay to cut your losses, because in a lot of cases, when they do that, the services are then forced to go back to the drawing board, and they will come up with something better, hopefully learning the right lessons from their most recent debacle.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to go back to the Q&A. This one for Bill, from Donald Smith. He says, military contractors provide fewer jobs than many other industries, such as education and healthcare. I threw in the healthcare. So why aren't there powerful jobs programs for other industries? Why do we see that? How can we make the argument that we don't need these jobs in these districts, because we can establish more powerful jobs programs in other sectors to sustain and grow more jobs?
Well, that's kind of the $886 billion question. I think part of it is more ferocious lobbying by the arms contractors. Part of it is a lot of their jobs are in very identifiable, consolidated places. You can point to the factory down the road. Whereas if you increase education that's spread across the country, it does a great amount of good, but the jobs are not concentrated in the same way. I think in healthcare, there's so many other issues the industry is grappling with, drug prices and so forth, that there's not sort of a lobby that's focused on, for example, hiring more nurses. Outside the Nurses Association, they're not getting a lot of support for an urgent need like that. So I think part of it is just concentration of power. I think, as former Rep. Speer said, just as members can be influenced by relatively small contributions, they can also be influenced by relatively small numbers of jobs. According to the National Defense Industrial Association, the number of direct jobs in weapons manufacturing has gone down from 3.2 million in the 80s to about 1 million now. So there's been outsourcing, there's been automation. Some places have moved their factories to non-union states, so the pay is not what it once was, and there's two-tier contracts where new people in the industry are not making the kind of money that one would often associate with those jobs. So they're kind of getting by, even though it's diminishing returns. And I think there will come a point where that becomes more obvious, and where people realize that, we really could be investing in things like green manufacturing, which if you cut, a substantial amount from the Pentagon and moved it into that area, you'd get a net increase of 250,000 jobs a year or more, according to a paper by Heidi Peltier at Brown Cost of War Project. So in a way, throwing money at the Pentagon costs jobs, and it also ties us to kind of an old style economy in a world where we really need to be looking at how do we get into the technologies and industries that are urgently needed and also are the most likely ones to grow, so that our solar panels aren't produced in China and we can't produce a decent mass transit vehicle and so forth. So, we need, as Miriam Pemberton said in her new book, we need a new investment strategy. It's sort of like the Pentagon has got special treatment. There's a Pentagon industrial policy, and everybody else is left to their own devices, more or less. Yeah, it's a tough problem, but I think there's room there to make some progress. And of course, I think the interesting thing about the Littoral Combat Ship is you talk about the military industrial complex. In that case, not all the legs of the stool were on the same page. The military wanted one thing, industry wanted another. So I think there are going to be cases like that where we may be able to shed more light on the problem and win some of these battles, as difficult as they may be.
That's a good point. And Jan Weinberg in the Q&A brings up the issue of the revolving door. And he notes that campaign contributions to members of Congress is one form of motivation, revolving door is the other. He asks which resources you turn to monitor campaign contributions and the revolving door. I mean, I would answer that POGO has been great. Dan's organization with citing and collecting information on the revolving door. As far as campaign contributions, opensecrets.org is a fantastic resource to track not only campaign contributions, but lobbying and the money that's going from the industry to Congress and to persuade members every year for particular programs and policies. Congresswoman, just talking a little bit more about the revolving door. I mean, as a member of Congress, I'm sure you're very much aware that staffers, particularly on the pertinent committees, are regularly rotating from Congress to industry, and Pentagon officials going from service to industry and vice versa. Over the years, POGO has charted this. Several individuals, during 2021, from the Pentagon, or the defense contractors hired from the Pentagon, and several individuals, and it ended up being like an $89 billion contract boon for those particular firms that hired from the Pentagon. So we can even track how the money is not only spent, but coming back. According to Cost of War Project, which Bill just mentioned, a third of total DoD spending goes to contractors every year. How much, Congresswoman, does the revolving door contribute to this overall problem, and how can we address it? How can Congress address it? How could American people address it?
So I would say that there are ways of addressing it. The real question is whether a Congress has the gumption to want to do anything about it. If you, for instance, said that generals could not go to work on the boards of defense contractors for, I think right now it's only 1 year. What if you made it 2 or 3 years? That your ability to be close to the acquisition personnel, I think, starts to dim after a few years. But even within the defense budget, and I uncovered this after chairing the military personnel subcommittee for 4 years. It wasn't until weeks before I retired that I found out about this mentor program where former officers could be hired as mentors to active duty officers for $50,000, $75,000 for a 6-month period of time. And many of these officers, retired officers, are so separate from their actual service. Like if you go back to 2008, this is a different military today than it was in 2008 or 2000, but many of those officers were being paid from this program. Well, so there's lots of those little nooks and crannies within the defense budget that allows for the care and feeding of those officers after they leave. And that's a problem. So I think you have to extend the period of time, the cooling off period. I was always distressed when I saw that there was an officer who made a decision on a particular weapon system, and lo and behold, a year later, they're on the board or working as an employee of one of the defense contractors. It's pretty, I use that word again, scandalous that we allow that to go on.
Yeah, and I know aside from dysfunctional, fraud and scandal, two of the words that you used are also very apt on this subject. Before getting to the Q&A, Dan, I had one more question for you that I think will be of audience interest. All of the official statements by the Biden administration over the last year, whether it be the National Defense Strategy or more recently the intelligence community's annual threat assessment, has identified China as a primary competitor and pacing threat. Congress has amped up its rhetoric in favor of giving the military all that it needs to match, if not overwhelm, China's capabilities in East Asia. There seems to be no restraint on the prospects of war with China over Taiwan. How much of this is benefiting the defense industry and their friends in Congress? And more importantly, is the massive amount of money being poured into the forces actually being spent wisely for a direct conflict with China? It would seem to me that like the LCS or the F-35, there are a lot of boondoggle programs out there that wouldn't actually be effective in an actual confrontation with China.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Kelly. So the China threat came along right at the right time for the defense industry and their allies in the services and even on Capitol Hill, because as the war on terror was winding down, military budgets started coming down a little bit, like at least year to year, and so the prospect of the China threat coming along helped nudge those budgets higher and higher, to the point where now we're talking about record-setting budgets that were higher than at any point in during the war on terror, when we had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of service members deployed all across the world. And that seems a little odd that in a time of relative peace for the United States, that we have record defense budgets. But then you look at how that money's being spent, and you realize that, wow, we really are not doing what we should be doing. For all this extra money that we're pumping into the Pentagon, you would think that we're greatly increasing our defense capabilities. But if you look at force structure, you see that that's not the case. The Navy's fleet isn't getting any bigger. In a lot of cases, the fleets of aircraft aren't getting any bigger, because we're retiring aircraft almost as fast, if not faster in some cases, than we can buy new ones. And the Army and the Marine Corps are both also shrinking. So the one thing that you can say about all that extra money is that it is not providing more defense. And I could go on and on about why I think preparing for a direct conventional military conflict with China is foolish. But let's just, for argument's sake, we'll accept that premise. In that event, you would need mass in order to deal with China, which has the largest military on Earth. They have a Navy fleet that's bigger than ours. Their army is way bigger than ours. And so, numbers don't count for everything in war, but they definitely count for a lot. And so, in case of that very, very unlikely scenario, we would need a lot more ships, a lot more planes, and a lot more soldiers. But we're not getting that for all the extra money that we're pumping into the Pentagon.
Okay, I'm going to go to Q&A, and we got a lot of questions in the queue. So, and some of them are a little on the devil's advocate side, like this one from Philippe Capet. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly, but he's asking, is there a danger that an improvement, I'm going to say an improvement in the efficiency of procurement might lead to an increase in our military power and then to a more aggressive military posture? If so, how do we manage that risk? So I guess he's asking, or maybe this is how I'm interpreting it. Say we fix the inefficiencies in the Pentagon, will that actually lead to some restraint, or just lead to being just more efficiently hawkish and more primacist? Does anybody want to answer that one?
Well, I can start. I think it's got to be a two-pronged approach. I think you need a more realistic strategy as well as a more efficient way of procuring the systems that the troops need. So the current strategy is sort of go anywhere, do anything. I mean, let's win a war with China. Let's win a war with Russia. Let's be ready to fight Iran and North Korea. Let's still keep the global war on terror under a different name. We've got counterterror operations in 85 countries. We've got 750 military bases. We've got 13 aircraft carriers, which are sort of like floating air bases. So I think you've got to look at sort of that investment. A few years ago, Lockheed Martin got us $75 billion from the Pentagon, which was larger than the entire budget of the State Department and Agency for International Development combined. So if we're throwing our money so disproportionately that direction, we're underfunding diplomacy. A lot of these issues like Taiwan are really should be dealt with diplomatically, not by preparing for a conflict that would be an unprecedented disaster for everyone concerned. So I think just fixing kind of procurement and curbing the ability of the industry to push out these dysfunctional systems is just one element. But I think, the things that you did in that regard would have some spillover effect, because a lot of the companies also fund think tanks. They're also on government commissions that help define what the threat allegedly is. So if you kind of pull back that pervasive influence, I think you would get a positive result. But it's a good question to think about.
I would just add that you're dealing with a Congress that's heavy on baby boomers even now. And I think as that changes, you're going to see a greater reluctance to do what we did last year, which is mind-blowing when you think about it. We just dumped another $45 billion into the defense budget just because that was the Republican price to pay to get the votes for the NDAA. And there's this pride that exists within the committees of jurisdiction that we've always had an NDAA every year. There's never been we've never not passed one. And so there's always this negotiation that goes on that leads to a handful of people throwing out amendments, dumping money into the bill. And I think what we did last year, and as I think Bill pointed out, is already seen as a base this year. It was like bonus money that was being given, and with no strings attached. Who knows how that money was being spent? The other point I'd like to make about the staffing issue is there are more military personnel in our various bands. I'm talking about musical bands than there are in the entire State Department. I like the music that they offer up for us, but there's a lot of members of those various bands. Yeah,
that's crazy. Let's talk a little bit more about that, the revolving door, because Bruce Schermerhorn has a question in which he asked, do contractors influence military personnel by providing perks through junkets disguised as meetings, conferences, educational programs, etc.? I'd like somebody on the panel to answer that and maybe flesh out the question or flesh out their answer by talking a little bit about how before some of these officers in the Pentagon even retire or leave, they are already being approached by the industry. They are already starting to feather their nest, so to speak, for a job with one of these companies after their retirement. Can you talk a little bit about these cozy relationships and how they are affecting programs in reality?
Well, I can start this one out. So I don't know a whole lot about junkets and educational opportunities and inducements like that, but I can say that it's just like well known that if you are perceived as being a good solid team member, that you're going to have lots of opportunities to go work in the defense industry after you leave. And there are some people that talk about it almost from the very beginning. I remember as a newly commissioned second lieutenant at the basic school way back in the spring of 2005, listening to another freshly minted second lieutenant talking about how his ambition was to go work for a defense contractor after getting out of the Marine Corps. And at that point, I was just thinking about, all right, what do I need to learn to, survive and win in Iraq? I certainly wasn't thinking about going to work for Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman after I retired. But it's just well known that if you go along, if you play the game right, then those opportunities are going to be there. But if you are the kind of person who asks difficult questions or in any way impedes the flow of money from the Treasury to the defense contractors, that no nice man in a suit from one of the defense contractors is going to approach you as you're getting ready to retire to offer you a lucrative sinecure when you take your uniform off.
Great answer, Dan. Anybody else want to follow up on that one?
I would just say two words, Fat Leonard. When you realize that in the Navy, a number of officers were plied with, dinners and drinks and escorts for giving, highly confidential intelligence. It's very disturbing.
That's a great point, Congresswoman. We didn't even get to the Fat Leonard scandal, which I know Dan loves to talk about. Maybe towards the end, if we have, I want to get through a couple more questions. But that's a great example of how the corruption has run rampant through the Navy. And I don't even think that we've really scratched the surface in telling that story, at least not here or in general. It's just such a tawdry tale. Joel Sokolsky has an interesting question that'll take you back to your American government days in school. He says, James Q. Wilson remarked that under the U.S. Constitution, quote, pork is kosher, end quote. Can the power of the defense industry over Congress be checked without fundamentally changing the nature of U.S. government that gives the legislative branch the power of the purse? Is it the system that is flawed that allows the Congress all of this money to play with?
Well, maybe I'll start. I think it's, when you think about pork is typically, those projects for your district, the bridge to nowhere. And for a long time, we got rid of them and then we've restored them, but under guardrails that don't allow for the kind of abuse that took place. The pork that's being referenced in the question is, I don't refer to these weapon systems as pork. They do, in fact, create campaign contributions for members. But if you wanted to really fix that, prevent members serving on the armed services committees from receiving campaign contributions from defense contractors. Now, I don't know if we could, if that would be unconstitutional, but that's how you would fix it.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, I think Congress needs the power of the purse, but there needs to be a lot more public scrutiny and pressure, which is, first of all, about transparency, knowing what's going on. Second of all, thinking that they can make a difference, which in this world of, disinformation and infotainment and, division in the country is maybe harder to achieve, but I think still essential. I mean, when Eisenhower gave his military industrial complex speech, he said the only effective counterbalance was an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. And I think he was right about that. It's just figuring out the best ways to reach people and also to let them understand that they have power, which I think is a big part of the problem. People don't think they can confront these kinds of large interests.
I want to stay with you for a second, Bill. Samuel Stettheimer has a question. He says, I know you've done good work on NATO expansion, reporting on it, and connections with the defense industry. Are U.S. contractors exercising similar influence on Finland and Sweden's attempts to join NATO compared to their oversized role in previous enlargements or expansions?
I think it's a little different now, but in the period of NATO expansion in the 90s, there was a group called the American Committee to Expand NATO, which was run kind of as a little side gig of a guy who was a vice president at Lockheed Martin. And the CEO of Lockheed Martin did a tour of Eastern Europe saying, if you join NATO and you buy our equipment, we'll actually help you join the club. So it was quite blatant back then. I think now it's somewhat different because Russia has invaded Ukraine, and Finland's already deep into buying U.S. systems, including combat aircraft. Sweden has its own industry, so it's a little different. So they may try to use this. I mean, certainly there's going to be a huge spurt of military spending in Europe. And the Stockholm Peace Research Institute just put out their annual analysis of the global arms trade. And they found that deliveries to Europe, about 2/3 of them came from U.S. companies. So Germany's already buying F-35s. Poland has bought U.S. tanks. A lot of the systems that they've given to Ukraine from European countries will be backfilled with orders from U.S. companies. So they're pushing on an open door. They almost don't have to lobby in the way they did back then because the trends are in their favor at the moment.
Thanks, Bill. I'm trying to get through all these questions. I'm afraid I'm not going to get through all of them because we got about a minute left. So I think what I'm going to do is, if I could just ask each of our panelists to just maybe make a final point, and maybe it might be what you perceive as the biggest challenge to reforming this issue, the military industrial congressional complex, biggest challenge, and maybe some, on a hopeful note, one thing that we could be doing or promoting that might get us one step away from the abyss. Who wants to start? Bill?
Gee, thanks. I think tackling the jobs issue, having a more forward-looking economy, because I think if we get bogged down in building these kind of legacy weapon systems, we're going to waste a lot of our engineering talent, a lot of our scientific talent. We're not going to solve the most important problems facing the country. And somehow I think that has to be understood by people, that it's not just about this or that weapon system. It's about what kind of future do we want for our kids, our grandkids? Do we want to have a future? So I think if we frame it in bigger terms in a way, while we go after these other incremental reforms simultaneously, that may be our best hope.
Congresswoman?
Well, I'm going to take a different tact. I think, the best disinfectant is the media. And the more we can interest the media into taking some of these systems that are extraordinarily expensive and helping people recognize not just the cost of the system, it's the maintenance that really drives up the budget. And if you picked off, the LCS or picked off the F-35, because of course there's going to be a newer, shinier, toy that they're going to develop. I think that would be one way to be successful. I think organizations like POGO, an organization I've worked with very closely on a number of issues, is also the kind of organization we want to see thrive. And I guess the hopeful thing I would say is no one thought that sexual assault in the military would ever be taken out of the chain of command. It took 10 years, but we did it. It was a horrific death of a service member at Fort Hood who was murdered and dismembered that finally got the attention. But it always is a seminal issue that kind of gets the attention, and then we can move forward on reform.
Thank you. Dan?
Well, congratulations on that great success tackling military sexual assault. That was that was a noble effort on your part, Congresswoman. I would say if I could get one point across, and this is a central theme to the Project on Government Oversight and our work over the last 40 plus years, is that technology isn't king. There's so much focus in Washington, D.C. on getting the next shiny object, and the idea being that all we need is this technological overmatch and we'll be able to win all wars. Well, that didn't work for us in Iraq or Afghanistan, and in all honesty, that rarely works, because you need good people wielding solid ideas, and then they need to have adequate tools. And that's I guess the big thing that I try to get across is that you don't need the most exquisite weapon system imaginable. You need something that's adequate for its purpose. If you go beyond that, then costs start rising and you can't get enough. They don't work well. Their maintenance burden is increased dramatically. So breaking that technology idea, I think, is the most important thing. But the hopeful note, and I'm at the end here, so I guess I really have to go big. I was really heartened back in January when all the debate was going on about who was going to be the next Speaker of the House, and a number of Republicans came out demanding that we cut defense budgets. That's amazing progress. If that can grow, if we can get like-minded Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill agreeing on that, then anything's possible. So that's my that's my shining or silver lining that I see in the future.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Bill and Jackie, for this fantastic conversation that probably could have went on for another hour, since we had about 45 questions in the queue. But I'm sure Bill will be hosting another conversation, not unlike this one, at some point for Quincy. Before I go, I'd like to take advantage of the close to 200 people that we have on the line right now, just to mention that we have a really exciting event coming up next week. It is in person and virtual, but I strongly suggest anyone who is watching today and is in the DC area to come by on Wednesday, March 22nd, a special Iraq War anniversary event called Bad News: How the Media Marched Us into War in Iraq and Beyond. It'll be taking place at George Washington University at 4:00 on Wednesday, followed by a free reception afterwards. I will be on the panel alongside Peter Beinart. Crystal Ball will be moderating, and Jonathan Landay, who is one of the few mainstream journalists to actually take on Bush's war policies, specifically WMDs. It's going to be a great conversation. Like I said, in person, online. It's on the front page of the Quincy Institute website, so you can check out all the details there. And thank you for everybody who attended today. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and we will see you next time.